Hi, everybody. My name is Roxy. I am with the Human Trafficking Legal Center, and I'm the lead for the Survivor Leadership Program here. Sorry, it's my 2-year-old in the background. I would like to welcome everybody to our new series on A Survivor's Guide to Criminal and Civil Trafficking Cases. I'm going to give a brief spiel about our partner, Survivor Alliance, which is an organization by survivors for survivors. If you're interested, we will definitely send some information about them towards the end of the webinar. You can gladly place your email in the chat box and we will send you not only information on Survivor Alliance, however, also a PowerPoint to this presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Martina. So sorry, guys. Martina Vandenberg, the president of the Human Trafficking Legal Center.
Thank you so much, Roxy, and thanks, Bryce, in the background. Working at home is really difficult for everybody. So we're delighted to be here today. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining for this incredibly important webinar. It's an honor for me to introduce Jose Alfaro. Jose Alfaro is a survivor leader who navigated successfully not only the criminal process with a federal case against his trafficker, but also successfully navigated the civil litigation system against his trafficker. Jose, since the end of those two cases, has come forward as a leader in the survivor community and has brought amazing attention to the issue of boys as trafficking victims, but also members of the LGBTQ community as survivors. Jose is working on a book, and so we're delighted and thrilled to have him here today to talk about a survivor's experience with the civil and criminal systems. He learned so much, and we think he has a lot to share with you. So Jose, I'm going to hand you the baton. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Martina. First off, I want to say thanks to Martina and Roxy for setting all of this up and helping me and guiding me through the whole process. But I also want to give thanks to the Human Trafficking Legal Center for having me because I think this is so important and I'm also very, very excited to be here. Also, a few more thank yous. I do want to thank any survivors that are attending today. I just want to let you know that you do not need a civil or a criminal case to feel like your story is validated. You are a survivor and you are validated. Also, I want to thank law enforcement, lawyers, and any advocates that are here today. I want you to know that we all need each other to learn and grow. And without each other, none of this would be possible. So one more thing I did want to mention why I wanted to do this. It was this entire process, which I'm about to go over, this entire webinar, this process was really, really hard for me to understand. From the beginning, just trying to catch on to the lingo and the vocabulary of lawyers or officers, I just really was lost. And there were many moments where I felt extremely embarrassed and ashamed that I couldn't understand. And I just want this to be an opportunity for survivors to better understand the process, but also for law enforcement to see what it's like for a survivor to go through it. That way they can make it a little easier for the process for survivors as well. So just to get started today, I do want to kind of mention a little bit of backstory. Basically, I want to touch on how I ended up being able to pursue a civil suit and to pursue or to testify within the criminal case. So I'm going to take you back to about 2007 when this all began. In 2007, I came out to my parents and my parents were not accepting of it and they kicked me out of my home. So 2007, I become vulnerable to many people, and those types of people are traffickers and also pedophiles. And it's that vulnerability that they know how to pick out a survivor or someone or a victim, someone who they can manipulate and control. And unfortunately, I fell under the control of Jason Gandy. So shortly after that, I ended up trying to find my way through life. I no longer had hopes and dreams. I started to feel like nothing was ever going to happen for me. I felt like I didn't have anyone to support me, to have my back, and I kind of lost my way. But I did what I could, and I did the best that I could. And there were a lot of things that I did that I'm ashamed of, but there are also a lot of things that I did that I learned and I grew from. And now I'm going to flash forward to 2012 when I moved to Boston, Massachusetts. And I moved to Boston. I began a career in cosmetology. I start to see a different life for me, a different path where I'm thinking, this is it. I finally made it. I have a career for myself. I'm getting a decent paycheck. I can afford rent. I can now start to move forward with my life. And I was ready to put all of what had happened to me behind me and move on from it. But unfortunately, unfortunately and fortunately, I had a friend come and visit me in Boston from Houston. And he says to me, he says, Jose, I know what happened to you when you were a teenager. And I'm like, no, you don't. You don't know what happened. And he's like, no, I do. And he was like, you need to read this article. Jason, the guy who trafficked you, is in prison. And I'm like, hold on. What do you mean trafficked me? I wasn't trafficked. This isn't what happened to me. And he's like, yes, you were trafficked. Mind you, at that time, I didn't understand what trafficking meant. I didn't know that what had happened to me was considered trafficking. And so I look over the article, and the article mentions that Jason was arrested in London trying to take a 15-year-old boy and I'm going to quote this, they basically said that he was going to pimp him out at the London Olympics. Now, I now know he was trafficking him there. And so then he went into custody shortly after. And so in 2012, this is when that trial began. 2014 is when it began for me. At the bottom of that article, it mentioned the Human Trafficking Hotline. And I remember this moment so specifically. I was crying in my bed and I was contemplating whether or not I should call this hotline. And I want to touch on this moment because I think that a lot of survivors or victims go through this to where they fear that what they did was their fault. And they also feel like they could still possibly get in trouble for the things that they did. And this was a moment where I was terrified. I was feeling in my heart like I needed to come forward and I needed to help. But then there was something that was holding me back that was saying, if you come forward, there's a chance you're going to go to prison. You're going to get in trouble. And so I remember I waited until 3 a.m. in the morning. This is how scared I was. And I was like, well, I'm not going to call. I'll just send a text message. And what's so cool about the hotline is you have the ability to send a text, send an email, or even shoot a phone call. And I felt more comfortable shooting a text. And I remember I sent that text really, really fast. And then I turned my phone off and I was like, oh my God, I don't know what I just did. And soon enough, shortly after, someone got in contact with me and they sent me a message back and they're like, hi, how are you? You know, they helped me through the entire process. And then the next day we had a phone conversation and they connected me to Homeland Security. And from there, I believe it was a couple of days after, they asked if I could meet with a few officers, but also to meet the US attorneys that were working on the case. And they brought me to that office here in Boston, Massachusetts, and we did a video chat with the US attorney, Sherry Jackson, and her associate, Janae Johnson. And I remember going into that room and I was so terrified because there's like 4 officers around me and they're trying to calm me down. But I guess the biggest thing for me is, oh my gosh, I have all of these police around me and I'm just like, it's always going to be an uncomfortable feeling. But they tried their best to calm me down and we got onto a video chat with Sherry Jackson and Janae. And they're like, Jose, just share with us your experience, what happened to you. And I went through everything and I just remember leaving that office feeling like I did something good. I had this weight come off of my shoulders. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this could actually help people. This is going to be really, really well. And so I go through that, and then shortly after, I start getting phone calls left and right. So I'm getting phone calls from private investigators. I'm getting phone calls from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I'm also getting phone calls from a woman named Stacey Jonas, who I love. Stacey Jonas. She is incredible, and I do believe that without her, I probably wouldn't be where I am. But she shot me a phone call, and she said, "Jose, have you thought about pursuing a civil suit?" And I'm like, I have no idea what that is. So I need to know a little information on what that is and what I have to do. And then the biggest question that I had is this going to cost me any money? Because I don't have any money and I can't pay for a lawyer. And she said, no, Jose, that's why I'm contacting you, is I have the resources. I'm hoping that I can connect you to someone, an attorney, that can pick up your case pro bono. And I said, what is pro bono? And she said, that means free, Jose. And I'm like, oh my goodness. Okay, cool. I'm like, I'm willing to do whatever I can. And if you think that this is something that I should pursue, then let's go through with it. And she said, well, I want to make sure that you're ready for this. And this is something that you want to do. She made me comfortable. She gave me options, which was incredible. I also want to mention that Stacey actually worked for Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid at the time. And they really, really helped me with so many resources. So I'm forever grateful. So that's happening, but I also want to touch base on all of those phone calls that I was getting, because that was a moment where I said to myself at the beginning that if I'm going to do this, I'm going to be 100% transparent, and I'm going to share with as many people as possible. And when I'm getting all of these phone calls, not knowing that some of these people were private investigators working for Jason Gandy, I'm taking these phone calls and I'm willing to answer any questions that they have. And no one informed me that I should or shouldn't be talking to them. So it was a very, very confusing moment. And then I remembered I mentioned to Stacey, I'm like, Stacey, these people are calling me. And she goes, wait, hold on, who's calling you? And I'm like, I don't know who they are. And she's like, hold on. She's like, if they're not the U.S. Attorney's Office and they're not me, she was like, do not talk to them. Just make sure you come to me first, and I'll let you know whether or not you should speak to them. So that was really scary, because I was like, I don't know who I'm supposed to be talking to, who I'm not supposed to be talking to. But for any survivors that have any questions on this, always, always, always refer back to your attorneys that are working on the case, and they will answer your questions and help you through it and tell you who you should and shouldn't talk to. So now we have the criminal process going on, and then I've also got this civil suit happening at the exact same time. And it's in this moment where I am told that I need to start preparing for restitution. Again, I didn't understand what restitution was until probably a couple of years ago, but Stacey's telling me we need to gather receipts. She's like, any receipts that you have, any medical receipts, whether it be medication, whether it be doctor's visits that are pertaining to this case. So if Jason had done any bodily harm to me, or if I needed any surgeries because of that, then these were all receipts that I needed for restitution. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I started to gather all of this information so early on, it really helped me be prepared for my civil suit, but also the criminal case as well. And so I started gathering all of this information. I will tell you, it is not easy. You know, you've got to think about everything, transportation to and from, you've got to think about medication, you've got to think about any mental health services that you need and what's coming out of your pocket. And so I started to save all of these receipts. I took screenshots of my Uber rides because I need Uber. And I gathered all this information. And then for the criminal case, Janae kept asking me if I had any evidence of what had happened to me with Jason. And I kept thinking, and I'm like, evidence? Like, how can I prove that this happened? This was 10 years ago. How am I going to go all the way back and find all of these things and I don't even know where to start. And so she was like, what about social media? What about photos? What about something with a timestamp, emails, text messages? And I was like, oh my gosh, I actually do have emails. I do have, you know, I didn't have text messages, but I had photos of when I was with him, and also the photos that he was using to gain clients to, you know, traffic me through. So I'm gathering all this information, and then weeks goes by, months go by, and then years start to go by. And I'm starting to think, why did I even get involved in any of this? This doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know if anything's ever going to come of this. And I started to lose hope. I'm starting to think like, this is just too much. I don't know if I can handle it. And then I get a phone call from Stacy a couple of years later, and she says, Jose, unfortunately, we cannot find an attorney that's willing to take on your case pro bono. She goes, I do have a few attorneys that are willing to take this on, but you would have to pay either a portion of what you collect, or you would just have to pay out of pocket. And I'm starting to think, you know what? I don't even know if I want to do this anymore. I began thinking like, I'm ready to move on with my life. I'm ready to be done with this. And I said to her, I said, look, let's continue to look for a pro bono lawyer. If we cannot find a pro bono lawyer, that's it. I'm totally fine. I'm ready to move on. And I said, but if we do, even better, we can continue the process and take it from there. And she said, okay. She was like, that sounds great. She goes, I want to make sure that we're doing what you feel is best. And I said, I'm totally okay with this. We do not need to find a pro bono lawyer if we can't find one. And she said, okay, great. She goes, and the biggest reason why it was such a big deal is I was about to hit my 28th birthday. And what this means is the statute of limitations was about to be up. So I believe for my case, the statute of limitations was up 10 years after my 18th birthday. And so because of that, we needed to hurry up and find someone so that we could go ahead and file this case. So, surprise. And I just recently, when I first met Martina, I learned about this, and it was a very, very special moment that Martina and I had together. I got a phone call from Stacy, and she said, Jose, I have some great news. Someone's willing to pick up your civil case. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is exciting. And I was like, what does this mean? What are we doing? And she said, well, the firm that's willing to pick up your case is Fish & Richardson, and they're willing to pick it up pro bono. And she was like, I'm just going to send all the files that we have for you over to them, and you should be all set. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is great. Now, fast forward to literally this year, I got in contact with Martina about another issue. And I learned that Martina was the bridge that connected me to Fish & Richardson, which was incredible. And I am forever grateful because, again, without everyone's help, I wouldn't be where I am today. And it probably would have been something that I have in the back of my head that I never would have processed the way that I have. So it's allowed me to open up, share, but also to heal as well. So thank you, Martina. You know, I love you for that. So Fish & Richardson picks up my case pro bono, and I send over the files. And again, it's a process where I have to answer all of the questions all over again. I had to go over from beginning to end with my story so that they could pick moments and things that they needed to bring forward during the case. Now, finally, things are kind of rolling. 2018. Yes, I said 2018. That is 6 years after Jason's arrest. So from 2012 to 2018, this is how long we've been waiting to go to trial. So I finally get the phone call from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and they're like, Jose, we're going to trial. This is the criminal trial. And they're like, we need to start getting you prepped and ready to testify. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I've only seen this in movies. I'm terrified. I don't know what this is going to be like. And they're like, don't worry, we're going to prep you. We'll get you ready. And so I want to mention this was a trial by jury. So that makes it even scarier because there are tons of people that are there, that are listening, that are watching, but also are listening to make sure they're basically going to decide what happens in this case. And so it's very, very intimidating. So they prepped me. And before I get into what happened while I was testifying, I do want to give a few tips to those who are ever in this process, who are ever having to testify. First off, I want you to find a place to focus. And what I did is I stared at the floor because the courtroom was so packed with people. I mean, it wasn't packed, but there were a good amount of people. But not only that, Jason's family was in the room, and it was very, very intimidating just to see the people within the audience. But then you look to your left, and literally right next to you is the jury. And I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, these people are like staring at me. They're staring into my soul. They know if I'm like lying or whatever, and I was just freaking out. So I just looked directly to the floor, and I remember there was a moment when the lawyer was like, Jose, can you please speak up? And I was so nervous that I was like talking like a little mouse. I was so scared. But find a place where you can focus and really try to take in the questions. If you do not understand the question, you can ask them to repeat that question as well. Number two, no one knows your story better than you do. And that's always going to be the case. No matter what you're doing, nobody knows your story. Nobody knows what you went through except for you. Number three, if you are being truthful and 100% honest, there's nothing you have to worry about at all. Number four, if you do not know the answer, you do not have to answer the question. And that is so important because I've heard of a lot of people making up stuff just to answer the question, and you do not want to do that. And number five, do not answer more than the question being asked. And also keep your answers very short if you can, if possible. And to be honest with you, when they told me that, I struggle with that because I can go on and on and on and tell you everything that happened. But they prepped me, they rehearsed, they helped me know exactly what they meant by just answer the question. So those are some good tips. Those are the tips that I have to offer you when you're testifying. Also, I did not get the opportunity to do this. And I'm not saying that Sherry Jackson did not do a great job, because she did a phenomenal job. But there were moments, and we even discussed this afterward, there were moments where there were things that I thought could have made it a little easier for me. And one of those things is taking your client through the courtroom and doing a little bit of a rehearsal, because there was a moment when when you're walking up and you testify that you're going to tell the truth. I didn't know if I was supposed to raise my right hand or my left hand. And then I didn't know if I was supposed to say I do or yes. And I was like, am I getting married? Like I had no idea. I was so lost. I was so scared. But just make sure that you do a walkthrough and really, really help the survivors understand what's going to be happening. And I know that people tend to forget that because you've been doing this for a long time, you've been studying it for a long time, but we don't know what to do. This was my first time ever doing anything like this. So I think that would be extremely helpful. So then cross-examination happened, and this was the moment that I was like scared of the most. And you'd think that I'd be scared to see Jason in the courtroom. To be honest with you, he looked so ridiculous. There was nothing that I felt was scary or anything. I was just like, you look insane right now. But that was not the scariest moment for me. The scariest moment was cross-examination. And I was terrified. I was thinking, this guy is gonna make me look like I'm lying, which is his job. And I remembered I read an article, which do not do this, but I read an article before testifying, and the article was from the defense attorney, so Jason's attorney. And he's saying all of these things that, one, statistically were not true, and two, just it made us look like we were lying. And I remember reading these and I'm thinking like, everyone's gonna think that I'm lying. Everyone's gonna believe these words that he said about us. And this was a moment that I was terrified of. And I will tell you this, the second that he kept telling me that he kind of in a way tried to make it seem like I was lying. And the more that he did this, the more comfortable I became. And it's because I got this adrenaline and this anger, and the fact that he was almost insinuating that I was lying, that really, really helped me push through. And it was that moment where after I was like, can we keep doing this? Because I want to keep going, because I actually think that I'm pretty good at it. And so I will say, at the end of it, that wasn't the hardest. If anything, it helped it to be a lot easier. So definitely helps to place your emotions in different places and helps you get through it. So the trial was in July of 2018, and then December of 2018, we find out the sentencing, and Jason was sentenced to 30 years in prison with no chance of parole. And I want to talk about the sentencing a little bit because there was a moment where I was upset. I was upset that I didn't hear life in prison. And that was something that I wanted to hear and the other survivors wanted to hear as well. And I kept thinking, why didn't he get life? Why wouldn't they just give him life? And then I thought about it a little more, and Sherry Jackson explained to us, she said, you guys think about it. He is 40 something years old, 30 years on top of 40. She was like, it's a life sentence. She was like, so it's a win all around. And so I took that into consideration and I thought about it and I was like, Sherry's right. This is exactly what we needed. This is exactly what should have happened. And from then on, I was like, great, this is awesome. You know, we won our case. It was something to celebrate. So then in April of 2019, we have the civil trial. And I'm thinking, this judge in Texas is not going to help me, is not going to be there for me, is not going to support me, and is not going to understand who I am and where I come from. And I kept thinking the way any person like myself, who is LGBTQ, who is Latino, who went through this entire thing, I'm just thinking, he's not going to help me. There's not going to be any justice today. And I hate that I went in like that, but that is how I felt in that moment. And so I was told that we are suing Jason for $450K. And I say that I was told that because I don't come up with that number. Survivors do not come up with that number. This is a professional who looks into it, who has a formula that helps figure out a number that you're deserving to help you, get through the rest of your life. And so we're suing him for $450K. Jason is not present. And also there is no jury present. It is just me, my attorney, Jason's attorney, and the judge. And there were a couple of other people there that were just taking notes kind of thing. So we're sitting in the room, I'm telling my story. We go over pivotal moments in my life that were hard for me. And I do want to mention something that I also just learned. This is such a learning process for me and also for any survivor that's going through it. Like I said, I can continue. The more that I dig into this, the more that I learn daily. And I just learned about the difference between a verdict and settlement. So because Jason was not present, I had a verdict from the judge. Had Jason been present with his lawyer, there could have been a moment where they tried to settle and he would have offered a certain amount of money that they believed would have helped me get through. Or if it's just the amount of money that he has that he's able to pay. But he was not present and there was no settlement offer. So we had a verdict, and it was on April 24th. So I testified for the civil suit on April 23rd. By April 24th, which was the day after, I get a phone call from Fish and Richardson, and they say, Jose, we have some very, very exciting news. They're like, we won our case. We won the $450K times 3. And I look at them and I'm like, times 3? What do you mean? And they go, the judge granted you 1.43 million. And I remember feeling like this is a moment where it's not only justice for me, this is justice for the LGBTQ community. This is justice for every Latino that's out there, every colored person that's out there. This is justice for also men who are going through, who have gone through similar experiences like mine. It just felt like this is more than money. And mind you, I also went in with the expectation that Jason didn't have any money. And so I'm thinking, I'm probably never going to see this money anyways. But for me, this piece of paper telling me that I won this amount and that Jason was going to owe me for the rest of his life was everything for me. So that was a moment that I'm so proud of. And it was also a moment where it kind of just gave me this moment to where I'm able to heal and to move on. And no, will I ever completely move on from this situation? Probably not, but it does help for sure. So now I am left with a verdict of 1.43 million, and that's in the civil suit. Mind you, I have no idea how to collect this. I have no idea what the process is going to be like. But also at the same time, and I don't want to lose you here because I am going to kind of go back and forth between the criminal case and the civil case. But within the criminal case, I am then told that we are going to be either collecting restitution or victims' compensation. And I want to touch base on what the difference is because I was extremely confused, but also I want to touch base on how that affects the civil suit as well. So for the victims' compensation is funded by the state. So depending on which state you're in, the rules are a little bit different for everyone. I also provided a link with Martina. I believe she's going to put it through in the chat. But if you click on this link, you can actually click on a map in which the state that you're living in or the state you were living in, and you can see basically the rules for victims' compensation within that state. I loved this site. I thought it was really easy to navigate, and it was very, very helpful with a lot of information. So I'm told that I'm going to be filing for victims' compensation and restitution. Now, restitution is funded by the defendant if he has it. If the defendant doesn't have it and the U.S. Attorney's Office believes that he doesn't have this money, then that is when victims' compensation comes to play. And what this is this is just to kind of help you get through what you've gone through, help you through life and move forward. So I have victims' comp, restitution, we file for both. Now I want to mention that you cannot receive both of these. It's either one or the other. So I file for both of those, and then after sentencing, I am told that the judge will agree to a number. And the way that they come up with this number is with all of those receipts that I told you about earlier in the webinar. So the judge agreed to $25K. I heard and I learned that the U.S. attorneys or the government sold or auctioned off Jason's property for $250K. And my first reaction was, oh, am I going to be receiving $250K? And if I'm not going to be receiving it in the criminal case, I'm probably going to receive it in the civil case. That is not how it worked. So I was told that I would only be receiving the $25K from for restitution. And then I have these questions and I'm like, so what happens to the other 225K? I'm like, it goes to my civil suit, right? And they're like, no, that's a completely separate case. This property was seized during the trial, so therefore it only pertains to this case only. And I'm just thinking, okay, well, then how do I collect the money in my civil case? And this was a really hard time for me because I was just super confused and I didn't understand it. And I also felt like I was cheated. They weren't cheating me. This is what they do. And so what happens with the other 225K is they usually forfeit it. In other words, it does go to the government, but they forfeit this money. So after this happens, now I'm left with, again, the verdict of 1.43 million. How am I going to collect this money? Will I ever collect this money? Does Jason have the money? No, Jason did not have the money physically, like in a bank account, but Jason had assets, and Jason had assets that were not seized by the government. And so I learned that I had to go and find these assets, and then I could, basically what they would do is they would seize the assets and then they would auction them off. Now, for me, I'm thinking, how am I ever going to find all of his assets? I knew he had a boat. I knew he had this. I knew he had, different apartments that he owned. And I'm like, how do I find them? And I was thinking that this was going to be easier than I thought. It wasn't. So there are a few ways that you can go about doing this that I learned on my own. So one of those is your civil attorneys have a database to where they can look up and try to find these assets. It can be hard sometimes. For me, it was hard. We had trouble finding all of his assets. So they're telling me this and I'm thinking, no, I'm going to find these assets myself if I have to. I will drive down to Texas from Boston and I will find out where these assets are. I do not recommend that. I was not told to do that. It was just a moment where I was like, I've got to find it. I've got to figure this out. And I also want to mention, you can also hire a private investigator. Now, this private investigator can help you and find all of this stuff. It's going to cost you money. So before you do that, my recommendation is be your own private investigator. And you're probably like, how am I going to do that? What does that even mean? I don't know how I did it, but I started by reaching out to the other survivors, asking if they knew of any property in Dallas, any property. I mean, there were a few other places that I heard throughout the case that Jason was living or moved to or was spending a large amount of time at. So I'm sure I annoyed the heck out of the civil attorneys, but I was like, can you look in San Diego? Can you look, in Pennsylvania? Can you look in all of these places? And I'm like, I will find an address for you. I just need you to look for me. And so I then get no information from the other survivors. And I'm just like, what am I going to do? Where am I going to look now? And so I went to social media, and there's so much information that you can find on social media. You just have to look. And I went to Jason's profile on Facebook, which to me is amazing that profile is still up, but it is. And I went to his profile and I scrolled, and it took me about an hour or two to go through his entire Facebook and read every single thing on his profile. And I found a status that had the exact address of the property that he owned in Dallas. And then from there, I shoot a text to my civil attorneys at Fish and Richardson, and I say, I found the property. And they're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, great work. And the reason why I mention that I did this on my own, I was also informed that the only way that you're going to expedite this process, as I've learned, any process that you're going through the law is going to take forever. It took forever for the criminal trial. It took forever for the civil suit. It took forever for restitution. this is going to take a long time. There's going to be a lot of things that they're going to have to file, has to go through the judge, yada, yada, yada. So my suggestion is you try to do the best that you can to find these things for the attorneys, and this will help expedite the process. So I didn't know this when I was doing it, but I did it anyways, and I learned that this helped us move a little quicker. So after I find the address and I send it to the attorneys, I then post on social media and I'm like, does anyone know how I can find this property? And I had a few realtor friends who were living in Dallas and they said, absolutely. And they're like, shoot me a message. And so I sent them a message, we're talking, and they go, easily, you just have to go to the appraisal website of Dallas and type in his first and last name or type in the address, and you will find what property he owns in Dallas. And sure enough, 2 properties pop up, and I'm like, great, I found it. I have the condo numbers for them. I send them the exact condo numbers. They're like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. Thank you, Jose. We will begin the process in filing for a seizure of assets. And then after, they filed to a forced auction of the assets. And so what happens with this money is this will be added, or this will be for my civil verdict. So the 1.43, this will go towards that. And I also want to mention one more thing, just because I'm getting to the end here. Anything that I receive from the verdict, this is the civil case, it is not tax-free. So you will have to pay taxes. So you don't want to get in trouble after having this big celebration with the IRS. So make sure that you file your taxes on that property. Now, the restitution is tax-free. So anything you receive in restitution, you do not have to pay taxes on that, which is great to hear. I have not collected any money in either of these cases. We're still going through the process. Like I said, it's a long process, but there are things that you can do to help expedite this. I think that I touched base on everything that I wanted to. So I think that we wanted to kind of open up the floor for questions, I believe.
So Jose, thank you so much. That was incredibly inspiring. And I've been monitoring the chat, and a number of people have popped up on the chat and said how important this information is and how grateful they are to hear this information from you. So thank you for sharing everything that you learned. We do have a question from Nat Paul, and Nat asks if you can talk a little bit more about restitution, because restitution, the process for determining restitution can be confusing to survivors, and it can seem kind of arbitrary. So can you talk about sort of how the restitution worked? Did you have to put in a form?
So it was literally right after the criminal trial. I sat at a round table with a few people that worked within the U.S. Attorney's Office, and they said, Jose, we just need you to fill out these forms. And thank God I had already collected all of those receipts, because they have a formula where they're going to add all of these receipts up together, and they're going to multiply it times another number, and they're going to decide how much you deserve based on these receipts. So thank God that Stacy had me looking for all of these receipts and collecting them. And I always say, if you're planning on testifying, or if you're planning on pursuing a civil suit, get on it already. Start gathering all of that information. So she had me fill out these forms, and she made me aware. She said, we're going to file for both. She goes, but you're only going to get one, depending on which one goes through. And so it had to go through a judge first, where the judge has to approve the restitution. And the judge did approve the restitution. Mind you, there were also 4 other survivors who came forward, and they were also applying for both. I believed, from what I had heard, the other 4 decided that they wanted to go with victims' compensation. So they went that route. Had they applied for restitution, that that money that they seized and auctioned off for the $250K, that would have been divided between all four of us. And then whatever's left over, again, goes to the government, and then they forfeit that money or decide whatever they're going to do with that. But because the judge said 25K is what I get, and that's it. So I hope that answers a little more clear.
So there's another question, actually, Jose. Someone has asked, what made you decide to go for restitution instead of victims' compensation from the state?
So I was told that Jason had property. And the thing is that when you're making this decision, you have to really think about, does the guy even have money to help me with restitution? Or am I just going to be safe by applying for victims' compensation, which is funded by the state? And as soon as they told me that they were going to be seizing the assets in Houston, I already knew that there was going to be enough to fund the restitution. And also the U.S. Attorney's Office kind of hinted and kind of helped guide me in knowing what decision to make. So that was really, really helpful as well.
So another question's come in, Jose, about jurisdictional issues. So you were in Boston, the case was in Texas. How did that work jurisdictionally, and who actually paid for you to travel back and forth, both for the trial and actually for the sentencing as well?
Yes. So that was actually a moment where I was a little confused as well. But it was the U.S. Government that flew me from Boston to Houston anytime that they needed me. So they flew me for the trial, they flew me for sentencing, and they also flew me for a speech that I actually gave shortly after. But they also paid for my hotel. And then I believe the word is stipend, if I said that correctly. They also offered a stipend for the day that will help kind of cover your food or any other expenses that are needed while you're there, which is great.
And Jose, you mentioned Stacey Jonas, this lawyer at Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, who is an absolute rock star. But
Yes.
How important was it for you to have a lawyer during the criminal case to help you navigate the criminal case?
Sorry, ask that question again.
So was it important for you to have Stacey Jonas, your lawyer, during the criminal case? Was it important for you to have a lawyer to help you navigate the criminal system? Do you feel like it would have been harder without Stacey?
100%, 100%. There were so many questions that I had that the only way that I was going to know what was going on is through Stacey. So I definitely needed her, and I definitely used her as much as I could. But I also will mention, from a survivor's perspective, at least for myself, I kind of felt like I was nagging. And I hope that, and it's not that Stacey made me feel that way. I just felt that way naturally. And I hope that people reiterate to their survivors or their clients, like, look, like, if you have any questions, like, please, please, please do not hesitate, and just keep saying that to them, because there are moments where you're just like, you're so lost, you're so confused, and you're like, but I also don't want to bother them. You know, I know they're busy, but I will speak for the survivor. If you have a question, be sure you ask that question. And I'm not saying that Stacey did not do this, because Stacey did this over and over and over again. She's like, Jose, I don't care what the question is, please call me, please ask. But just to reiterate that, ask as many questions as you have, because this is not something that you went to college for. This isn't something that you were educated on. This is something that you're gonna learn and you're gonna grow. And sooner or later, you'll kind of catch on to everything. But I will tell you, for me, I didn't catch on until it was all over. So,
So Jose, you caught on to absolutely everything and a lot. And as a pro bono attorney and someone who refers cases out to pro bono attorneys, I can only emphasize what Jose has already said, that the lawyers are happy to answer questions and they're thrilled when you call. And so you shouldn't feel shy or that you're nagging. That's not it at all. I think they volunteered because they wanted to answer those kinds of questions. So we have another question. How did you come to terms with the fact that you were a victim of trafficking? You're so brave for going through all of this for so long, and thank you so much for sharing your story.
Well, thank you. So this is actually an important question. And the reason why is I felt strange when people called me a survivor. I felt like that's not what I am. Don't call me that. But I have come to terms with it. And the way that I came to terms with it was, one, getting help. I know that I needed some form of therapy. And I will tell you, through a lot of this process, I had not received any therapy. And I 100% recommend for survivors to go through therapy and get the help that they need, because these are traumatic experiences, and it could be any moment in your life where all of this comes back up. So when I got that visit from a friend from Houston, that was a moment where all of the stuff that I placed in the back of my head, all of that trauma, everything that I had gone through now started to come forward. And when that comes forward, I'm telling you, you're going to go into a really, really dark place. You're going to find ways to cope, and it's probably not going to be the best way. But I had a really, really tough time. There were moments of suicide. There were moments of deep depression, anxiety. I then learned what PTSD meant, and I learned that I had extreme PTSD. And it was really, really, really hard for me. But then after going through the trial, again, I had those moments. And then I decided, because I was asked by the U.S. Attorney's Office to speak about my experience. And I want to touch on this a little bit because I want survivors to understand that when you decide to come forward with your story and share it with people, you have to be prepared. And I don't mean prepared giving a speech or prepared with the information. I mean, be prepared because you are officially giving life to your story. And now people are hearing you and people are listening, and that's going to feel great, but it's also going to, again, put you in a really, really dark place. So make sure you are ready and that you are strong enough to come forward and share, because I had a really, really tough time shortly after, and I was not expecting it. I thought, this is going to be easy. I can share my story, no big deal. I've been living and somewhat telling it to friends and family. It's going to be simple, but it's not. And I will say though, the more I have shared, the more I have, basically shared my story, I've noticed that I've become stronger and stronger, and I don't have those moments anymore to where I'm in a dark place all the time shortly after. Now it's getting a lot easier for me. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I think that's very, very helpful. If people do have questions, please do put them in the chat box or in the Q&A box. And we have another question for you that goes to the comments that you just made, Jose, from a lawyer. Is there anything that would help from legal staff in those times of darkness? Is there anything that your lawyers can do to help during those times?
During the trial, yes. And I will mention this. Janae Johnson, she checked in with me constantly. She checked in with me and she said, Jose, how are you? It wasn't, Jose, we need this information from you. We need X, Y, and Z. Can you make sure you get it to us ASAP? It was, Jose, how are you? How are you handling this? Are you okay? Do you need services like a therapist that we can get you in contact with so that you're going to be okay? And I said, no, I'm doing fine. And she was like, are you sure? She was like, because we have resources, we can help you. And that, to be honest with you, that is like the biggest thing that you can do, is making the survivor feel like they are taken care of and they're not going to just be left there to figure things out on their own and left there to deal with all of these new emotions that are coming up from the past. So definitely check in as much as possible just to make sure that the client or the survivor is doing okay mentally.
Jose, that's such an important point. Someone just pointed out in the chat that state victim compensation programs often will pay for therapy for victims of crime. So did you have a link to a non-governmental organization? Was there an organization that was helping you through this while you were going through the process of the criminal case?
I don't believe so. No, I wasn't talking to any organizations during any of this. But also going into it as a survivor and someone who had I never in a million years thought that I would testify in a case, but going through it, you also don't even know that any of that's available or to even think. And they did offer and say, Jose, like, do you need therapy? Do you need this? We have resources, but it wasn't along the lines of really truly understanding what they meant, how they were going to help. And so I think that's also important to do, is to really go into a little bit more of an explanation of what types of resources are out there and available for survivors of human trafficking. Because if you don't know, you're not going to ask. And if you don't know what else they mean besides therapy, or if they don't explain that, they would pay for it, it might push the survivor to look the other way and say, no, I'm fine. I think the biggest thing for me was, I don't want to have to pay for anything that I'm going through all of this. I want to, if anything, you want to get money to help you through life. And for me, it was like, no, I don't want to do that because I'm probably going to have to pay money. But I do think it is important that you mention the details of what type of resources are available.
So Jose, we have another question and we just have a couple of minutes left. So I wonder if you could speak to the survivors who are in the webinar audience today. What message would you give to the survivors? And the question that just came in is, what message would you give to survivors, particularly those who are afraid of their traffickers, whose traffickers may still be at large and not under arrest?
Absolutely. It was really tough for me. I think that for me, it was a moment where I knew Jason. I knew him personally. We somewhat had a relationship, not like a boyfriend relationship, but we had a friendship. And there was a moment where you start to go in your head and you start to think, I feel so sorry for him. I feel really bad. And you have this instinct that you want to help that person. But I have to tell you, going through it and noticing and realizing that there are other victims out there, it really helped me to put in perspective what we were there for. And I think that you have to constantly remind yourself, I am here so that this guy can never do this ever again to another person. And that, for me, honestly helped me get through everything, because all I kept thinking was, and I remember this moment when I read that article, I started to blame myself for what happened to the 15-year-old boy that was taken to London. And I started to blame myself, and I started to say, like, this is all your fault. Like, you should have come forward a long time ago and put him behind bars so that he would not have done this. But you also have to remember, like, we don't know what it was that happened to us, and we're fighting for our lives and we're trying to survive. So I guess what I would leave you with is, you are strong just by getting through what you've gotten through. I mean, that alone is courageous. It is incredible. You don't have to go and do a civil suit. You don't have to pursue a criminal case. And you also don't have to share your story if you're not comfortable doing so. I just chose to do it because I felt like I needed to be a voice for those that aren't able to speak up. And there aren't a lot of people who come forward who are males or who are gay, because statistically they, make us feel like we wanted it, or we, it doesn't happen the same way, but it totally does. I hope that message was clear.
So Jose, I think that's so helpful. And I think all of us on this webinar are so grateful to you for your courage. This has been incredibly inspiring, but also very helpful from a practical perspective of people who may be going through criminal or civil suits. So I just want to applaud everything that you've done and thank you. And I hope that you will continue this work, and I cannot wait to read your book.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I can't even tell you how honored I am to have this opportunity. It was, I can finally breathe now, but but it was honestly a great experience. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Jose. Thank you everyone for participating, and we look forward to seeing you on the next Survivor Leadership webinar. Good night.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.